The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton's firing range as recruits lined up for their monthly qualification test. Among the sea of nervous faces and crisp uniforms stood someone who didn't quite belong. She wore civilian clothes, a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, and carried herself with an understated confidence that seemed out of place. Among the chattering soldiers, Captain Rodriguez noticed her immediately. She looked to be in her early 30s, with short brown hair tucked behind her ears and observant green eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Unlike the recruits who fidgeted with their equipment and whispered last-minute tips to each other, this woman stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. "Who's the civilian?" Rodriguez asked Sergeant Martinez, who was checking names off his clipboard. Martinez glanced up, following the captain's gaze. "Special guest from the Pentagon, sir. Some kind of evaluation or inspection. Orders came down from Colonel Stevens himself. Said to treat her like any other observer and let her watch the qualification rounds." Rodriguez nodded, though something about the woman's posture nagged at him. She wasn't watching like a typical Pentagon bureaucrat or military contractor. Those people usually asked questions, took notes, or at least showed some sign of why they were there. This woman simply observed, her attention focused entirely on the firing line preparations. The range master's whistle pierced the morning air, calling everyone to attention. 24 recruits stepped forward to their assigned positions, checking their M4 carbines and adjusting their protective gear. The woman remained in the observation area, about 30 yards behind the firing line, but Rodriguez noticed she had positioned herself with a clear view of every target downrange. As the first group of recruits took their positions, Rodriguez found himself glancing back at the mysterious observer more than watching his soldiers. She never moved, never shifted her weight, never even blinked excessively. It was the kind of stillness that came from years of training, not the fidgety patience of someone unused to military environments. The commands began. Lock and load. Assume firing position. Watch your lanes. The familiar ritual of marksmanship training unfolded as it had thousands of times before. But today felt different. Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being evaluated by someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. When the first volley of shots rang out, Rodriguez watched the woman's reaction carefully. She didn't flinch at the sharp cracks of gunfire like most civilian observers did. Instead, her eyes tracked systematically from shooter to shooter, as if she was cataloging every stance, every grip, every sight picture without needing to see where the bullets actually hit. The morning progressed through 3 firing positions: prone, kneeling, and standing. With each position change, Rodriguez noticed the woman's attention seemed to intensify, though her expression never changed. She watched Recruit Thompson struggle with his breathing technique, saw Private Garcia anticipate the recoil and jerk his shots low, observed Corporal Williams's textbook form, with what might have been the slightest nod of approval. By the time they reached the final standing position round, word had spread quietly among the range staff about their mysterious observer. The range safety officer, Master Sergeant Brooks, had served for 22 years and claimed he'd never seen anyone watch a qualification with such focused intensity. Even the ammunition handlers found excuses to walk past her position, curious about the woman who stood like a statue while chaos erupted around her. As the last shots echoed across the range and the ceasefire command was given, Rodriguez realized he'd spent more time watching the watcher than monitoring his own soldiers. The woman had remained perfectly motionless for over 2 hours, never checking a phone, never taking a drink of water, never even shifting her weight from one foot to the other. It was almost unsettling how completely she'd absorbed everything happening in front of her. The recruits began clearing their weapons and gathering their gear, the familiar post-qualification chatter filling the air as they compared their performances and complained about the wind conditions. Through it all, the woman in the gray sweater continued her silent vigil, waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. Rodriguez checked his watch and realized Colonel Stevens was due to arrive any moment for his weekly range inspection. Perhaps that's what she was. Waiting for the colonel's arrival would explain her presence and hopefully solve the mystery of who she was and why she'd been watching their qualification with such unprecedented attention to detail. Colonel Stevens arrived precisely at 1100 hours, his polished boots clicking against the concrete as he strode toward the firing line. Rodriguez snapped to attention along with the rest of the range staff, but noticed that the woman in civilian clothes remained exactly as she had been, motionless, observing, seemingly unaffected by the colonel's presence. "Report, Captain," Stevens commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years in the Army. Rodriguez began his standard briefing about the morning's qualification scores, range conditions, and safety protocols. But he could see the colonel's attention wasn't entirely focused on his words. Stevens had spotted the civilian observer, and his eyebrows raised slightly in what Rodriguez recognized as curiosity mixed with mild irritation. "Captain, who authorized a civilian on my firing range during live fire exercises?" The colonel's tone was neutral, but Rodriguez knew him well enough to detect the underlying concern. "Sir, I was told she was a Pentagon observer. Special evaluation, your authorization," Rodriguez replied carefully, suddenly wondering if there had been some miscommunication in the chain of command. Stevens's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "I issued no such authorization, Captain. No one from the Pentagon contacted me about any observer today." The colonel's gaze fixed on the woman, who still hadn't acknowledged his presence or shown any sign that she was aware of their conversation about her. The tension on the range began to thicken. Master Sergeant Brooks stepped closer, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. The recruits, sensing something was wrong, began to quiet their post-qualification conversations and focus on the developing situation near the observation area. "Ma'am," Colonel Stevens called out, his voice projecting across the 30 yards between them, "I need to speak with you immediately." For the first time in over 2 hours, the woman moved. She turned slowly, deliberately, and began walking toward the colonel with the same measured confidence she'd maintained all morning. Her stride was precise, economical, and somehow familiar to everyone watching, though none of them could immediately place why. As she approached, Rodriguez noticed details he'd missed from a distance. Her civilian clothes were well-fitted but unremarkable, the kind of outfit designed not to draw attention. Her shoes were practical walking shoes with excellent grip, not what most Pentagon officials wore to military bases. Most tellingly, she carried herself with a bearing that spoke of years of military training. Despite having no visible rank or identification, she stopped exactly 6 feet from Colonel Stevens. Not the casual distance of a civilian, but the precise spacing of military protocol. When she spoke, her voice was clear, calm, and completely unexpected. "Colonel Stevens, I apologize for any confusion regarding my presence here today. I was asked to conduct an informal assessment of your range operations and marksmanship training procedures." Stevens studied her carefully. Something about her tone, her posture, and her choice of words suggested this wasn't a typical Pentagon bureaucrat or contractor. Military personnel developed an instinct for recognizing their own kind, regardless of what clothes they wore or what identification they carried. "I wasn't informed of any assessment," Stevens replied, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone navigating potentially sensitive territory. "May I see your credentials and authorization?" The woman reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a leather folder. As she handed it to the colonel, Rodriguez caught a glimpse of her movement. Smooth, practiced, the kind of motion that spoke of someone accustomed to being armed and ready. Even the simple act of reaching for identification was executed with tactical awareness. Stevens opened the folder, and his entire demeanor changed instantly. His shoulders straightened, his expression shifted from suspicious to surprised, and Rodriguez could see color drain slightly from the colonel's face as he read whatever was written inside. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Every person on the range seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though none of them understood what. The woman waited patiently while Stevens processed whatever information he'd found in her credentials. Finally, Stevens looked up from the folder, his eyes meeting hers with a new understanding. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tone Rodriguez had never heard from his commanding officer before. A mixture of respect, surprise, and something that might have been awe. I had no idea," Stevens said quietly. "Had I known, the entire morning would have been handled differently. We would have arranged proper protocols, appropriate recognition." The woman shook her head slightly, the first gesture she'd made that seemed genuinely human rather than militarily precise. "That wasn't the point, Colonel. I needed to see your operations as they actually are, not as they would be if you'd prepared for a formal inspection. Rodriguez found himself holding his breath, along with everyone else within earshot. Whatever was in that leather folder had transformed their commanding officer from a confident colonel into someone who seemed almost nervous in this woman's presence. Colonel Stevens closed the leather folder carefully and handed it back to the woman, his movements now carrying a formality that hadn't been there moments before. Rodriguez watched this exchange with growing bewilderment, trying to understand what could possibly be in those credentials that would affect his commanding officer so dramatically. "Would you like to inspect the weapons and equipment?" Stevens asked, his tone now deferential in a way that made Rodriguez's head spin. This was the same colonel who'd dressed down generals for minor protocol violations, yet here he was practically offering to give this civilian woman a personal tour. "That won't be necessary, Colonel. I've seen what I came to see," she replied. Then, for the first time since Rodriguez had noticed her that morning, she seemed to really look at the soldiers around her. Her gaze swept across the recruits who were still standing near their firing positions, took in the range staff who were pretending not to stare, and finally settled on Rodriguez himself. "Your people run an excellent range," she continued, addressing Stevens but speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "Safety protocols are textbook perfect. Instruction is clear and consistent, and your soldiers show good fundamental marksmanship skills. Recruit Thompson needs work on his breathing technique, and Private Garcia is anticipating recoil. But overall, this is exactly the kind of training environment that produces competent marksmen." Rodriguez felt his jaw drop slightly. She had been watching closely enough to not only identify individual soldiers by name, soldiers she'd never been introduced to, but to diagnose their specific technical problems from 30 yards away. That level of observation required expertise that went far beyond typical military contractor knowledge. Master Sergeant Brooks stepped forward, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how did you know the recruits' names and their specific shooting problems?" The woman glanced at Brooks, then back to Stevens, who nodded slightly as if giving permission for her to answer. "Name tags are visible from quite a distance if you know where to look, Sergeant. As for the shooting problems, certain mistakes create predictable patterns in stance and grip. After 20 years of watching people shoot, you develop an eye for these things." 20 years. Rodriguez felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. 20 years of watching people shoot suggested military experience, probably extensive military experience, but that still didn't explain why Colonel Stevens was treating her like visiting royalty. "Ma'am," Rodriguez found himself saying, surprising himself by speaking up, "are you active duty military?" The question seemed to amuse her slightly. "Not exactly, Captain. My status is complicated." Stevens cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to my office," he suggested, but the woman shook her head. "There's no need for privacy, Colonel. These soldiers deserve to know why someone was evaluating their training." She turned to face the gathered personnel more directly, and Rodriguez noticed that her stance shifted subtly, not quite coming to attention, but moving into something that resembled a military bearing. "I'm conducting assessments of marksmanship training across multiple installations," she explained. "The Army is always looking for ways to improve accuracy scores and reduce ammunition costs during training. Your range has been identified as one of the more efficient operations, so I wanted to see your methods firsthand." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, the kind of thing Pentagon efficiency experts did all the time. But Rodriguez still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The way Stevens had reacted to her credentials suggested something far more significant than a routine training assessment. Sergeant Martinez, who had been quiet throughout the entire encounter, suddenly spoke up. "Ma'am, I've been running this range for 8 years, and I've never seen anyone watch qualification like you did today. You stood completely still for over 2 hours, tracked every shooter, caught problems I didn't even notice until I checked the targets. That's not normal observer behavior." The compliment seemed to please her. "Thank you, Sergeant. Attention to detail is important in this line of work." "What line of work is that exactly?" Martinez pressed, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Before she could answer, Colonel Stevens stepped forward. "I think that's enough questions for now," he said firmly but not unkindly. I'm sure our guest has other installations to visit today. The woman nodded in agreement. Actually, I do need to be moving on. Thank you for allowing me to observe your training, Colonel. Your operation here is impressive, and you should be proud of what you've built. She began walking toward the parking area, but after a few steps, she stopped and turned back. For a moment, Rodriguez thought she was going to reveal something more about herself, answer some of the questions that had been building all morning. Instead, she simply said, "Keep up the good work, soldiers. Marksmanship saves lives, and you're teaching it the right way." As she walked away, Rodriguez noticed something he'd missed before. Her gait was precise, economical, and somehow familiar. It reminded him of something, someone, but he couldn't quite place the memory. It wasn't until she reached her car, a nondescript sedan that could have belonged to anyone, that the nagging familiarity finally clicked into place. Rodriguez watched the woman reach her car and suddenly felt a chill of recognition wash over him. The way she moved, the precise economy of motion, the perfect situational awareness. It reminded him of videos he'd seen during advanced marksmanship training. Specifically, videos of Olympic and international competition shooters, the kind of elite marksmen who could place 10 shots through the same hole at distances that made ordinary soldiers shake their heads in disbelief. "Colonel," Rodriguez said carefully, not wanting to sound foolish, "that wasn't just a Pentagon observer, was it?" Stevens was still watching the woman's departure, his expression unreadable. When he finally turned back to Rodriguez, there was something almost protective in his manner, as if he was weighing how much to reveal. "Captain, there are some things that are better left unspoken," Stevens replied diplomatically. "What I will tell you is that the person who just observed your training has forgotten more about marksmanship than most of us will ever learn." Master Sergeant Brooks, who had been unusually quiet since the woman's departure, suddenly stepped forward. "Sir, I've been thinking about where I might have seen that shooting stance assessment technique before. The way she identified specific problems from that distance, the way she analyzed grip and breathing issues without even seeing the targets." Stevens looked at Brooks with raised eyebrows. "And, sir, I think I know who that was." Brooks's voice carried a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "About 15 years ago, I was stationed at Quantico for advanced marksmanship instructor training. We had a guest lecturer, someone who was supposed to be one of the best competition shooters in the world. Military background, multiple Olympic trials, national championships, the works." Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken. The pieces were starting to form a picture that seemed almost too incredible to believe. "The instructor that day," Brooks continued, "demonstrated shooting techniques I'd never seen before, could identify shooter problems from observation alone, knew every recruit's name within minutes of meeting them, had this way of standing perfectly still for hours while watching range operations. But here's the thing, the instructor never showed up." "What do you mean?" Stevens asked, though his expression suggested he already knew where this was going. "There was some kind of classification issue, security clearance complications or something. We were told that the planned demonstrations would have to be canceled, that the instructor's identity couldn't be revealed for operational security reasons. We spent the whole day doing regular qualification instead." Brooks paused, looking between Stevens and Rodriguez. "But sir, I think our guest today was supposed to be that instructor 15 years ago." The implications hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. If Brooks was right, they'd just been observed by someone whose skills were legendary within military marksmanship circles. Someone whose identity was classified at levels that made colonels nervous and whose expertise was so valued that the Pentagon would send them to evaluate training programs without advance notice. "Sergeant," Stevens said quietly, "I think you should keep those theories to yourself." But Rodriguez's mind was racing ahead, connecting dots that painted an even more extraordinary picture. "Colonel, if that assessment is accurate, then we were just watched by someone who could probably outshoot everyone on this range combined. Someone whose marksmanship skills are classified at levels that require special authorization just to observe training." Stevens didn't deny it, which Rodriguez took as confirmation. Recruit Thompson, who had been standing close enough to overhear, spoke up with the kind of innocent directness that only comes from youth and inexperience. "Sir, are you saying that lady could shoot better than all of us?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Rodriguez found himself remembering the woman's stance, her observation skills, the way she'd identified shooting problems with supernatural accuracy. If she was who Brooks thought she was, then better than all of us was probably a dramatic understatement. Thompson, Stevens said carefully, let me put it this way. If that woman had picked up a rifle this morning and shot alongside you during qualification, she probably would have posted scores that would make your best day look like amateur hour. The recruits exchanged glances, trying to process the idea that they'd been observed by someone whose skills were so far beyond theirs that comparison was almost meaningless. Rodriguez understood their confusion. He was struggling with the same cognitive disconnect between the quiet civilian observer and the legendary marksman she might actually be. But sir, Private Garcia asked, if she's that good, why didn't she shoot? Why just watch? Stevens looked toward the parking area where the woman's car had disappeared, then back at his soldiers. Because, Private, when you're at that level, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Watching, analyzing, understanding, that's how you help others improve. Showing off is for people who still have something to prove. Rodriguez realized that Colonel Stevens knew exactly who their observer had been. Had probably known from the moment he'd looked at her credentials. The respect, the deference, the protective attitude. It all made sense if they'd been visited by someone whose reputation in military marksmanship circles was legendary. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the range when Sergeant Martinez made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their morning visitor. He was cleaning up the observation area when he noticed something glinting in the grass where the woman had been standing. Captain Rodriguez, Martinez called out, holding up a small military challenge coin. She dropped something. Rodriguez walked over and took the coin, examining it carefully. It was unlike any challenge coin he'd ever seen, heavier than normal, with intricate details and text that made his hands tremble slightly as he read it. The front bore an eagle surrounded by stars, and the back contained words that made his breath catch in his throat. Colonel Stevens, Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying an urgency that made everyone on the range turn to look. Sir, you need to see this immediately. Stevens approached quickly, took the coin from Rodriguez's outstretched hand, and his expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, recognition, and something that looked almost like reverence. Jesus, Stevens whispered, so quietly that only Rodriguez could hear him. I should have known. Sir, what does it say? Rodriguez asked, though he'd already read the inscription himself and could barely believe what his eyes had shown him. Stevens held the coin so that the gathered soldiers could see it, though his hands were visibly shaking now. The inscription on the back read, Presidential Unit Citation, Distinguished Marksman, United States Army Special Operations, Service Classification Level, Black. The silence that followed was profound. Every soldier on the range understood the significance of what they were seeing. Presidential unit citations were rare enough, but one combined with special operations classification levels that most of them had only heard whispered about in advanced training courses was almost mythical. Master Sergeant Brooks stepped forward, his 22 years of experience evident in his careful tone. Sir, if that coin is authentic, then our observer this morning wasn't just a competition shooter or Pentagon assessor. No, Stevens agreed, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward to hear him. She wasn't. Recruit Thompson, still processing the morning's events, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Colonel, what exactly is service classification level Black? Stevens looked at the young soldier for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood the sensitivity of classified information. Thompson, that classification level means that everything about this person's military service, their real name, their unit assignments, their operational history, even their current status, is classified at levels that most of us will never have clearance to access. It means they've done things for this country that officially never happened, with skills that officially don't exist. The implications hit Rodriguez like a series of physical blows. They hadn't just been observed by an expert marksman. They'd been evaluated by someone whose shooting abilities were so extraordinary that the government classified their very existence. Someone who had served in operations so sensitive that acknowledging their participation could endanger national security. Sir, Rodriguez said carefully, when she was analyzing our shooters this morning, identifying problems from 30 yards away, calling out specific techniques, she was operating at about 10% of her actual capability, Stevens finished. What seemed impossibly skilled to us was probably routine observation for someone at her level. Private Garcia, who had been struggling with his shooting technique all morning, suddenly understood why the mysterious woman had been able to diagnose his recoil anticipation problem so easily. Sir, she knew exactly what I was doing wrong because she's probably trained hundreds of soldiers who made the same mistake. Or, Stevens corrected gently, because she's trained herself to overcome every possible shooting error at levels of precision that turn marksmanship into an art form that borders on supernatural. Martinez was still staring at the challenge coin, trying to process what they'd learned. Colonel, if someone at that level was evaluating our training, what does that mean for our range? For our soldiers? Stevens took a deep breath before answering. It means, Sergeant, that someone very high up in the chain of command wanted to know if we're teaching marksmanship correctly. And based on her comments before she left, I believe we passed that evaluation. The weight of the morning's events was beginning to settle on everyone present. They had been in the presence of someone whose skills represented the absolute pinnacle of military marksmanship. Someone whose service record was so classified that her real identity would probably never be revealed to them. Sir, Rodriguez asked, should we try to return her challenge coin? Stevens shook his head slowly. Captain, I suspect that coin was left intentionally. People at her level don't accidentally drop things, especially not items that significant. I think she wanted us to understand who had been watching us today, even if she couldn't tell us directly. As the implications continued to sink in, Rodriguez realized that every soldier on Fort Braxton's firing range had just experienced something extraordinary. They had been evaluated by someone whose legend would probably outlive them all, someone whose shooting skills were so far beyond normal human capability that even acknowledging their existence required special security clearances. The mysterious woman in the gray sweater hadn't just been an observer that morning. She had been a living reminder of what human dedication and skill could achieve when pushed to limits that most people couldn't even imagine. 3 days after the mysterious visitor's departure, Colonel Stevens received a call that would provide the final piece to the puzzle that had been consuming his thoughts since that morning at the firing range. The call came through secured channels from a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably familiar. Colonel Stevens, this is your recent range observer. The woman's calm voice came through the encrypted line. I wanted to thank you and your people for your professionalism during my evaluation. Stevens found himself snapping to attention despite being alone in his office. Ma'am, it's an honor. We found your challenge coin. I assume you meant for us to find it? A slight chuckle came through the phone, the first truly human sound Stevens had heard from her. You assume correctly, Colonel. Sometimes it's important for good soldiers to understand that their work is valued at the highest levels, even when that appreciation can't always be expressed openly. Ma'am, if I may ask, what was the real purpose of your evaluation? My people have been wondering since you left. There was a pause, and Stevens could almost sense her choosing her words carefully. Colonel, you're training the next generation of soldiers who will serve in places and situations that you may never know about. Some of those soldiers will face circumstances where a single accurate shot might save dozens of lives, or where missing that shot could cost them everything. The marksmanship fundamentals you're teaching aren't just about qualifying scores. They're about bringing people home alive. The weight of that statement settled on Stevens like a physical presence. Every day, his range sent qualified marksmen out into the Army, never knowing where they might serve or what they might face. The idea that someone with legendary skills had personally evaluated their training methods carried implications he was only beginning to understand. Your assessment, ma'am. How did we do? Colonel, in 30 years of evaluating military training programs across 4 services and 12 allied nations, your range ranks in the top 5 I've ever observed. Your safety protocols are flawless, your instruction is clear and consistent, and most importantly, you're teaching shooters to think, not just to follow procedures mechanically. Stevens felt a surge of pride that he knew his entire command would share. To receive that level of praise from someone whose expertise was legendary was beyond anything he'd hoped for. There is one recommendation I'd like to make, she continued. Recruit Thompson has natural ability that goes beyond what his current scores reflect. With proper advanced training, he could become an exceptional marksman. Private Garcia's recoil anticipation problem is actually masking excellent fundamental skills. Once he overcomes that habit, he'll be one of your top shooters. And Sergeant Martinez has instructor potential that shouldn't be wasted on routine range maintenance. Stevens grabbed a pen and began taking notes, realizing he was receiving personalized assessments from someone who had observed his soldiers for just a few hours, but understood their potential better than he did after months of working with them. "Ma'am, may I ask how you were able to see so much in such a short observation? When you've spent decades perfecting a skill, Colonel, you develop an eye for recognizing that same potential in others. Every great marksman goes through predictable stages of development. Learning to identify where someone is in that progression and what they need to move forward becomes second nature." Stevens understood now why her security classification was so high. Skills at that level weren't just about shooting, they represented an understanding of human potential and military capability that could provide strategic advantages in situations where ordinary expertise wasn't sufficient. "Colonel," she continued, "I want you to know that your range will be used as a model for training improvements at installations across the country. The methods you've developed here will help train thousands of soldiers over the next decade." The implications hit Stevens immediately. His small range at Fort Braxton had just become the template for Army marksmanship training nationwide, based on the assessment of someone whose opinions carried weight at the highest levels of military leadership. "Ma'am, my soldiers would be honored to know their work is valued so highly." "They should be honored, Colonel. Not everyone gets personal evaluation from someone at my level. The fact that you passed that evaluation with distinction is something they should remember throughout their careers." As the call was ending, Stevens finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since she'd left. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what should I tell my people about who you really are?" The pause was longer this time, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed to encompass years of service that could never be fully acknowledged. "Tell them, Colonel, that sometimes the most important work is done by people whose names will never appear in history books, whose achievements will never be publicly recognized, but whose dedication to excellence makes it possible for others to serve with confidence. Tell them that when they teach a soldier to shoot accurately, they're contributing to a tradition of marksmanship that has protected this nation for generations." After the call ended, Stevens sat in his office for several minutes processing everything he'd learned. His soldiers had been evaluated by someone whose skills were legendary, whose service record was classified at the highest levels, and whose assessment would influence Army training doctrine for years to come. When he finally walked back to the range to share what he could with his people, Stevens carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the greatest honor comes not from recognition, but from knowing that your work has been witnessed and valued by someone whose expertise represents the very best of what military service can achieve. The mysterious woman in the gray sweater had been more than an observer that morning. She had been a reminder that excellence exists, that dedication to perfection matters, and that sometimes the most important evaluations come from people whose identities must remain forever unknown.